Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Hawzhin Azeez, and I'm joining you, unfortunately, by a pre-recorded video because I'm feeling a little bit unwell, and so unfortunately, I'm unable to actually join you live through this session. So first of all, my apologies for that. Secondly, thank you so much to Louison for all of their hard work and efforts to bring this wonderful and important seminar together. Thanks also to the other panelists, Sergey and Angelica, who will be discussing the concept of prisons and the police system across the world. So first of all, I'd really like to apologize because I'm not feeling very well. So I'm actually in quite a lot of pain. So I've taken quite a few painkillers, but my breathing is a little bit irregular because I'm experiencing a lot of anxiety as a result of my health right now. So my sincere apologies about that. But let's try to get started immediately, because I think, discussing the concept of alternative ways of which we can organize society, especially in the era of the global pandemic and COVID and what's been happening internationally, and with the lockdowns and the increased amounts of efforts by governments and states to increase government surveillance and control over society. The discussion around Rojava and Rojava's security system is more relevant than ever before. So one of the reasons why I'm here and I'm thought to be the person to be one of the right people to discuss this issue with you is because I spent about 4 years living in Rojava from starting of 2015 to about the end of 2018. And I was a board member of an organization called the Kobani Reconstruction Board. And for that period of 3 to 4 years, we basically engaged in the reconstruction of the city of Kobani, which had been targeted by ISIS and had sustained extensive amounts of infrastructure damage in relation to schools, hospitals, roads, electricity, water facilities, and so on. One of the things that ISIS did really well in its efforts towards terrorizing societies and communities was to, especially when they were losing, they would often attempt to destroy as much of the essential infrastructure of a society as possible as they were retreating, as well as implement very sophisticated systems of booby trapping and leaving unexploded devices in very, very intricate systems across the rubbles of the cities that they were leaving behind. So part of my job was to engage in the reconstruction and the rebuilding of Kobani. So in the process of living there, I am probably one of the few people who lived in the region for such an extensive period of time. And I had the privilege of witnessing the revolution that was occurring there, the kind of institutional changes, political, social, and economic, and cultural changes that were occurring there, and to actively participate in the communes and cooperatives and some of the different institutions that were occurring or being developed at the time. So one of the first things that I want to say when I want to raise the concept of Rojava is that there's a lot of criticisms and there's a lot of judgments and there's a lot of misconceptions and lack of information out there about exactly what is happening in Rojava, what kind of system is being implemented. And I think one of the first things that I want to say as a feminist, as a Kurdish person, as an academic, as somebody obviously who's Kurdish and who has experienced the revolution firsthand, I really want to emphasize the idea that just because something is occurring in Rojava, for instance, and the society there is very bravely engaging in extensive social, political, economic, and security changes there, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is a utopian system, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it is a system which is complete, and that the kind of institutional changes that they are implementing there is, again, utopian, and that's it. This is a kind of system that we should try to emulate, or this is the kind of system that we should try to reproduce in our own societies. In fact, according to the concept of the ideology of democratic confederalism, which is the sort of the umbrella concept that guides this Rojava revolution is that, you know, societies need to be very innovative. They need to look at their own conflicts and issues and problems within their own specific societies and try to formulate and construct solutions that are specific to their own societies. So what I'm trying to say is that something that is currently working in Rojava may not necessarily work in your own societies. But the important thing for us to realize is that, you know, seeing alternative systems, seeing alternative ways of people radically organizing themselves, living in an entirely different way that would have, in a, you know, couple of years ago would have been almost unimaginable, really serves as a profound lesson, serves as a you know, as an example of how we can also aspire to change our own societies and our own communities in ways that are meaningful and relevant to our own specific societies. So I do want to preface this entire conversation by saying that you know, by no count am I saying that this system in Rojava and the security systems that they've implemented there is a complete utopian system, but it is an alternative. And perhaps by looking at what is happening in Rojava, we can learn certain lessons, we can take certain things away from it. We can also, most importantly, look at what has worked and also what hasn't worked. And of course, this is a revolution. This is a society in a state of extensive and a phenomenal amount of, you know, socio-political, economic, and institutional changes. And so these changes are almost in a living laboratory. There have been many cases of cooperatives and communes and examples and cases and efforts that have failed. But that failure is not necessarily an indication that the system in Rojava is not necessarily working, but rather that there's attempt to change and progress, and that there's attempt by the people who live in this region to see what works and what doesn't work. And this is all part of the process of being innovative and trying to try out different kinds of institutions and modes of coexistence and, you know, different aspects of a radical democracy that could possibly work or may not work after experiencing it. So for those who aren't very familiar with Rojava, Rojava is a region in the northern parts of Syria. Almost certain that everybody knows what's been happening in Syria since the civil unrest and conflict, which started in 2011. So the Kurdish people are a minority, numbering for about 4 to 5 million people in Syria. And for many, many decades, the Kurds had always been oppressed, had been deliberately targeted by the regime to, you know, by the regime implementing basically organized and institutionalized poverty and underdevelopment in the region. So this is a region which is still very much underdeveloped. It lacks many of the necessary institutions and infrastructure. There are no universities, you know, government funded and run universities in the northern parts. There are very, very small, minimal clinic-like hospitals, no major institutions, no major railways, roadworks, anything along those lines operate, with the exception of the city of Qamishli, which had always obviously been under the control of the regime and still is largely to some extent under the control of the regime. So, you know, the foundation was very much there for the Kurdish people to rise up, because they had been experiencing decades of intense state-sponsored violence, terrorism, extrajudicial killings, imprisonment, you know, any efforts at representation of their cultural practices, such as the Kurdish New Year called Nowruz, would result in mass imprisonment, torture, abuse, killings, shootings of people. You know, there were large numbers of people in the 60s and the 70s and 80s who had been basically summarily, you know, removed from their homes, and their homes had been given over to Arab families coming from the central and southern parts of the states of Syria. And so people had been displaced deliberately. People had their IDs confiscated and removed from them. So they were non-state entities that lived under the borders of Syria. And that, of course, meant that they couldn't send their children to school. They couldn't access hospital, healthcare, any of the basic institutions and services that you would take for granted were not accessible to almost 500,000 people, Kurdish people, and their crime was obviously being Kurdish. And of course, at the same time, you know, the Kurdish people were rising up and resisting across the border in Turkey. in what is called northern Kurdistan, Bakur, of course in southern Kurdistan, in northern Iraq, which is called Bashu, and of course there has always been efforts towards efforts of resistance from the Kurds in Rojhelat, which is the eastern parts of Kurdistan. Taking a deep breath. So the Kurds are very familiar with oppression, state-sponsored violence and oppression and terrorism. And so very early on, as a result of the rise of the resistance of Kurdish people in Bakur, in the Kurdish parts of Turkey, there were efforts to try to resist this kind of state-sponsored violence and abuse and terrorism. And that bred similar resistance movements in other parts of Kurdistan, and part of the splinter movement that rose up in the late 1970s in Turkey under the Kurdistan Workers' Party, otherwise known as the PKK, moved over to Syria as a result of security needs or necessities. Now, why is this important? How is this related to security systems? The reason why I'm giving this sort of a short, very, very condensed history and background is because of the sole and primary reason is that the revolution that we are seeing right now in Rojava in 2020 is a direct result of work that had been done in the last 10, 20, 30, basically 4 decades by some of these Kurdish movements. They had been trying initially to implement some sort of a socialist revolution along the lines of Marxist-Leninism, but then eventually, as a result of the imprisonment of the Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan, this concept of democratic confederalism, this new blueprint of a radical democratic society emerged. And so what we are seeing in relation to the institutions and the organizations that are emerging, which are very radical and new in Rojava, it's as a result of some of this ideology of democratic confederalism, which advocates that society needs to be radically reorganized. And one of the most fundamental elements of this new society needs to be based on the premise, the non-negotiable premise of women's liberation. And this is very important for the kind of society that is being organized and developed in Rojava. And it's very important also for the kind of security systems and apparatuses that are being organized or that are being dismantled as well. So this concept of democratic confederalism basically argues that, if we want to create a new society, women's liberation needs to be at the basis of this new system. When you empower women, you create more equality, and you allow societies, basically half of the voices of society, to have a say in the kind of society that we are organizing. And of course, this involves a lot of learning from past lessons of women participating in revolutions in Algeria, in Lebanon, in France, in Iran, across Russia, across some of these societies where women had actively participated in the nationalist liberation efforts of their communities. But then post-revolution, they had been relegated back to the private sphere and back to the kitchen. And in many, many cases, they actually lost a lot of the freedoms that they had pre the revolution. So this democratic confederalism is trying to really learn from past lessons, and this non-negotiable element of women's liberation underpins the kind of ideology that creates a new system of police system in Rojava. So, this kind of oppressions that evolved resulted as a result of monolithic religion, the nation state, and capitalism working hand in hand to create a very unjust, unequal, hierarchical, and oppressive society that oppresses communities based on race or gender, or based on their beliefs, or based on their skin color, or simply for having ideas that are contrary to the status quo of the political elite. So the concept of democratic confederalism was very much inspired by the works of Murray Bookchin, who really wrote very, very extensively about how you can reorganize society so that it is no longer capitalist, no longer sexist, no longer hierarchical, and so therefore no longer as oppressive. And the basis of Murray Bookchin's ideology kind of worked on the foundation of, you know, a social ecology, liberating the ecology. And then when you liberate the ecology, society begins to naturally democratize. And then you have communes and cooperatives and so on that kind of builds this web of democratization across society. So the marriage between Mari Bookchin's, you know, social ecology and Abdullah Öcalan's concept of genealogy, or the liberation of women, have come together to form this concept of democratic confederalism. And so democratic confederalism is built on three important non-negotiable pillars. The first pillar is that of the direct democracy, encouraging society to become a lot more democratic, to become politicized, very much involved in having a say in the kind of changes and decisions that occur within their societies, women's empowerment, of course, and as well as ecological sustainability. And so the relationship between these three pillars underpins and builds this foundation of a new society. And so a lot of changes have occurred. Women have been empowered. There's all kinds of quotas. There's co-leadership. There's a 40% gender quota within any particular institution. There's, you know, cooperatives and communes that have been built. There have been street level, neighborhood level, you know, city level, regional level councils, which are important decision-making bodies that determine what happens within a community and what laws are accepted and what hasn't been accepted. A new constitution or a social contract has been established, which is very, very egalitarian and very much democratic, enshrining this idea of the universality of human rights, and of course, women's rights as well. So I really want to emphasize the importance of women's liberation and ecology underpinning the kind of ideology and the mentality and attitudes of the people in Rojava, which has encouraged new types of policing systems or security systems to be developed. And I think without this ideology, it would not be possible to have the kind of security systems that are being established, which are more just, which are a lot more egalitarian and democratic and more pro-society and pro-democracy than the kind of police systems that we are seeing. I think, looking at what's been happening in the United States and with the whole crisis that occurred and had been occurring for many, many years, but kind of really came to the forefront of the international discussion around policing and the prison system, is with the unjust murder of George Floyd. And we saw the kind of riots and the justifiable anger of the communities in relation to this ongoing racist, white supremacist murder of Black bodies and Black people. And so this has really raised a lot of questions about the way in which we've organized our societies and the kind of institutions and systems we allow every single day to operate and to control and to monitor us. So I think I want to come back to this idea that what's happening in Rojava is that we've recognized in Rojava that the kind of systems and the kind of society that we want to live in and have lived in are all socially constructed. The police system is socially constructed. It's an institution that has really, existed for just over 100 years. It's a socially constructed idea, and just as it is a socially constructed idea, it can be deconstructed, and we can construct new systems and new ways of existing. So looking at Rojava as a result of these pillars, of the three pillars of direct democracy, women's empowerment, and ecological sustainability being non-negotiable elements of the way in which society lives and coexists with one another, and all of these quotas and cooperatives and communes that create a very intimate, interlinked web of connections and relationships and civil society and democracy across society, it really has politicized communities. And mind you, this is again a community which is very underdeveloped, has high rates of illiteracy. People were barred from having access to higher education or even basic education in many cases. And often when they did have access to education, it would be in the language of Arabic and in different languages as opposed to their own mother tongues. So the kind of new systems that are implemented across Rojava is three pillars, okay? Again, three systems. I'm sure you've heard of the People's Protection Unit and the Women's Protection Unit, the YPG and the YPJ. They're kind of sort of like the military system that protects the community from outside forces and threats such as ISIS or, Turkey, the Turkish system's, fascist and ongoing system of violence and land annexation and terrorism towards the Kurdish people, towards other minorities such as the Christian communities, Armenians and Yazidis in the region. So the YPG and the YPG operate solely in protecting the community from external forces. Then just below the YPG and the YPG, we have the Asayish system, and then parallel to them, we have what is called the Civil Defense Forces, also known as the HPG. So the Asayish is kind of almost on an ideological and on a practical level similar to the police system, but although they're sort of disempowered on many levels. The Asayish's role is to protect the city on the local level. Okay, so the YPG on the larger regional level, the region of Rojava, the Asayish protects the cities and the larger regions from external forces, from terrorist forces coming from one region to another, perhaps from the central and southern parts, or the parts where Turkey and its allied jihadist forces are attempting to implement instability and all kinds of violence towards communities. They are also responsible for, addressing crimes committed. And of course, I mentioned that Rojava is a very small region and the communities know each other. These are small farming regions and small towns and communities, and almost everybody knows each other. But that doesn't necessarily mean that crimes, theft, abuses, domestic violence, all kinds of, kind of low-level petty crimes don't occur. They do occur. And so the Asayish is responsible for investigating this, if there's been an accusation of something. Mind you, the Asayish is almost, has that 40% quota. So there are women's Asayish forces who solely deal with gender-based and gender-related issues. If there's domestic violence, if there's an honor killing, if there's a forced marriage, if there's any sort of an issue relating to gender and violence towards women, the women's forces go in under this concept that women feel more comfortable speaking to other women, and that women naturally understand each other more, especially because probably most of them at some point or another, previous to the revolution, hopefully, would have experienced some of the gender-based abuses and violences that were prevalent across society. So the Asayish is very much divided between the two genders, and they are responsible for sort of investigating issues and crimes that occurs within society. If there needs to be an arrest, if there needs to be an arrest of a woman, if she has committed some sort of a crime, it's the women's Asayish forces that go and arrest her. You will never see a man going and arresting a woman. That just doesn't occur. The society in Rojava is very, 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 very aware of the way in which women have been disempowered under the capitalist sexist system. And so all kinds of processes and mechanisms, from women's only safe spaces, the women's village of Jinwar, which I had the privilege of being one of the sort of the designers. My NGO actually designed the village of Jinwar. Women's houses, women's NGOs, women's anti-domestic violence organizations, civil society organizations, all kinds of institutions are organized so that women have access to legal mechanisms and to justice and to repatriation and ways of addressing conflicts and issues in their lives that are gender-based. So the Asayish protects the society from external forces, but also from internal forces wherever a crime may occur. Then you have the HPG, the Civil Defense Forces, and this is really, really interesting. So the Rojava region is a region that is under constant attack by outside and external terrorist organizations. There are a multitude of different terrorist organizations at the borders waiting to invade. ISIS, although it has been sort of declared internationally to have been eliminated, it hasn't. It is reformulating and constantly reorganizing itself, partly also because it's being armed and funded and supported by Turkey across the border, but also Turkey's ongoing invasion and annexation and bombings and all kinds of illegal international behavior that Turkey is engaging towards the region as well. So as a result of these, the HPG act as a secondary protection unit, largely because in 2015 there was a secondary, Kobani had been liberated in late December, early January. The liberation of Kobani was widely declared. And then a couple of months later, a group of ISIS, a brigade basically entered through the Turkish border, blew up the Turkish gateway that, separates Turkey from Syria, from Rojava, and entered and engaged in a wide-scale massacre, going house to house, murdering people in their beds at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning, and they were dressed as YPG and as YPG units. So people were very confused about why the YPG were knocking on their doors and wanting to enter, and then when they entered, they were shooting people. So the YPG formed as a result of this extra security need, and they often protect society during festivals, major events, ceremonies, martyr ceremonies, any sort of an official event that is held wide scale and in which security may be an issue. But they also patrol their neighborhoods, only their own neighborhoods, only their own streets. And so you'll have, a bunch of YPG from one neighborhood who are controlling or would stand in the early evening or afternoon and would monitor their community at night until first thing early in the morning, where the chances of any kinds of crime or any sort of a terrorist attack are exponentially increased. And they would stand at strategic points, and people know each other, people know who lives in the community, people know who is a member of this street or that street, and so they know each other. So it's a community protecting each other. It's the community providing security for each other. And it's very important to say that the YPG, only in the case of some sort of a terrorist crime or some sort of obviously, if they're watching somebody breaking into their neighbor's house, it's kind of like a citizen arrest. They can actually arrest people, and they work hand in hand with the Asayish forces to take these people to court and have the judicial justice system implemented. And of course, they have an entirely different type of a judicial system that occurs at the community level. And if the crime is petty or if something that can be resolved, it's usually the community elders, men and women, that come together and they have a decision. They speak to the person who has committed the crime. Why did you commit this crime? Is it poverty? Is it mental health? What kind of issue? Is it domestic instability? And they try to actually work with some of the other institutions, such as the Women's House, the cooperatives and communes, to see what the needs of that particular individual is and why they committed that crime, as opposed to simply taking them, throwing them into a jail and then throwing away the lock and not caring what happens to that person. So the system in Rojava is not geared towards punishment, it's geared towards rehabilitation, but it's also geared towards understanding that the people who commit these crimes are members of our own families and communities and streets and neighborhoods. And so that kind of cultural norms and practices around honor and ethics really helps to create a system of shame, which prevents a lot of people from engaging in crimes. But where crimes do occur, the community comes together and everybody becomes aware, and it's not something that you can hide, and it's not something that you have the capacity of having, personal privacy, where I've just engaged in theft or rape or murder or something along those lines, and I get to maintain my privacy. The entire community engages in discussions. The cooperatives come together, the communes come together. Why did this crime occur? What can we do to prevent future crimes? Let's go and speak to the family of the person who committed the crime. What can we do to support you? Is there a particular problem that you're experiencing that the community can support you with? So where a crime is committed, it's the community's responsibility. It's not the person, the criminal's responsibility. It's not an isolated case. It's a social problem that needs to be addressed, and the entire community on multiple different institutions come together and they address what needs to be done. Sometimes laws have been changed. Sometimes institutions have come together and they've engaged in discussions. Some have really promoted the idea of having prisons and imprisoning people for an extensive period of time. But the idea more in Rojava is aligned with the notion of there's no point in imprisoning somebody. This is a capable member of the community and they could be contributing back. So let's see what we can do, instead of getting them to, be sitting in prison for 6 months or, 3 years, get them to participate actively and to be monitored in their community events, to become a member of a cooperative, to participate through the cooperative in learning a trade and possibly even, supporting their own family. So the kind of ideology of this democratic confederalism is very, very pro-society, whereas what we're seeing in the Western world with their police systems, it's very anti-society, it's very hierarchical, it's very oppressive, it's very much geared towards white supremacy, it's very much, anti-queer people, anti-trans people, anti-brown people, anti-immigrants, anti-refugees, anti-anyone who is other and who is different and who is feminized and who is ostracized by this sexist capitalist system. So the fundamental thing that I want to leave you with is that if we want to see change in our societies, we need to really see changes across the kind of ideologies that exist, because you can't have a capitalist system and envision a new system of, non-policing, because the capitalist system is hierarchical, it's sexist, it's oppressive, it's racist. It's anti-ecology, it's about destruction and domination and hierarchy. And so that kind of ideology will always breed the kind of institutions and organizations such as the police system in the United States, and the kind of white supremacist ideology that permeates across this institution, which is very, very terrifying, I think. Whereas in Rojava, when you see the Hapajis, when you see your uncle and your cousins and your sister and your mom standing on the street corner, you have that connection, that personal connection, and you have that accountability. And you know that if you do something wrong, there are multiple ways in which you can get basically your ass whooped without having the police, basically shooting you because, you're playing with a toy gun. So this is very, very important. And I think, another element of what's happening with the Hapaja and the Asayish and the Yepaja is that everyone across society at some point or another has gone to some sort of a military training to protect themselves and their community and their family. And when they go to this training, there's widespread training across society to implement and to introduce a concept of democratic confederalism, radical democracy, women's empowerment, and ecological sustainability across society. And so by the cooperatives and many of the communes, regular educational seminars are held. Some of these educational seminars go for weeks, a month, 3 months, 6 months. People are in these educational seminars for 6 months, learning about their civic duties, about the history of capitalism, about the history of colonialism, about the way in which gender and the patriarchy, gender oppression and the patriarchy was implemented, about environmental destruction and degradation, what they can do to live in a more, civil, democratic society. And so through the institutions, through the education systems that are happening, and almost everybody at some point or another has gone to some of these educational seminars, we call them Perwarda in Kurdish, and you are encouraged to repeatedly go to these seminars. Some of these seminars are based on gender, some of them are about radical democracy. What is radical democracy? What does it involve? What are your responsibilities as a citizen? What do you have to do? And of course, anti-capitalist and anti-colonial and all kinds of history lessons that are repeated across different cooperatives and communes that really educates and arms society. And I think that's the fundamental thing that I want to say. It's not the weapons that protect the community. It's not even the different institutions that protect the community. It's the ideology which people are actively educated towards constantly. Participating in 3-day seminars, participating in 1 month Parwarda, participating in 3 months Parwarda, and so on. And so society has gained a deep awareness and understanding of where hierarchies occur, how to resist hierarchies, that their participation across multiple different cooperatives and communes and different institutions helps them to gain a higher level of involvement and become more politicized and more invested in what happens in their communities, where crime occurs, where there's injustice, where there's any kind of inequality that occurs, and the community comes together and there's a lot of dialogue and discussion. I don't know how long I've been talking. I think I'm maybe a little bit over my time. I want to go back again to what I started this conversation with by saying that the system in Rojava isn't necessarily perfect, and they're still trying to address a lot of their internal conflicts and problems. They're working very hard to address racism. They're working very hard to address sexism. They're working very hard to really reinforce the notion of the importance of the ecological, social ecology, as well as the idea of, fighting against imperialism, that just because the Kurds are a dominant group and force in the north, it doesn't mean that they have to dominate and oppress other minorities such as Armenians and Christians and so on. And so a lot of these discussions, these anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-imperialist and pro-ecological discussions and dialogues that are being held all help to move society forward towards progress and towards a more just and equal society. Is Rojava the most just and equal society that exists in the world? I'm sure there would be many that would disagree with it, but there are definitely aspects of this system that are very, very, very important and very profound for the implications in relation to having and creating a more just and equal society. So I really encourage everybody to read a little bit more around Rojava, to see what kind of systems and institutions they are implementing, to see how they are resisting the hierarchical structures of the the capitalist modern nation state, how they are resisting the capitalist system, how they are trying to redistribute wealth within and land within society so that they can allow the community to develop a certain level of economic stability. And of course, the cooperatives really help in that regard. Having said that, I'm very well aware that some of the cooperatives failed. Some of the cooperatives just didn't work. And then so the community had to come together and form different kinds of cooperatives. So let's say, for example, they had cooperatives to bake bread in the community, and that didn't work because they had massive factories that would kind of distribute mass bread, for example. Whereas they thought that perhaps if they had, cooperatives that would create locally produced jams and chutneys and something along those lines, that kind of product actually sold much better, and the community was more invested in these kind of products and consuming these kind of products. So everything that we live, the societies that we live in, all of the institutions, the way that we think, the way that we behave, from our gender to our sexuality, all of it is socially constructed, and all of it can be socially unconstructed as well. So think about ways in which you can challenge yourself as an individual to deconstruct some of the patriarchal, sexist, racist, capitalist behaviors and attitudes that you have, and then look around, connect with like-minded people, see what kind of conversations that you can have, especially in the period of COVID, where social distancing is so necessary, but also has really disintegrated and dissolved a lot of community bonds and a lot of activists and the kind of profound work that they were doing to support their communities. We really need to, as activists, as academics, as people from the left, as feminists, as ecologists and environmentalists, really need to come together and formulate alternative ways of supporting our communities, because more than ever our communities are suffering. More than ever there's economic inequality becoming more and more prevalent and more obvious. And of course, we know that there's a lot of injustice within our political systems across the world, wherever you may live. So it starts on a personal level. It starts from a personal decision and commitment to live in a radically different way, by committing myself to educating myself about the kind of different systems and organizations and institutions and revolutions and changes that are occurring in Rojava, in Latin America, in Asia, in different parts of Africa, across the Middle East, and seeing what works and what doesn't work, and finding and collecting like-minded people and working with each other with the profound belief that we are all good people and we want to work together, and we aspire towards cooperation and aspire towards creating a more democratic, more equal and just society, where every single one of us is capable of leaving their house without fearing, especially if you are Black or a person of color, of being abused, of being executed by the police, or being picked up by the security forces of the government, to being subjected to all kinds of arbitrary violences from the state. And so we need to empower societies and communities. We need to build bridges between communities, and this is why communes are such an important aspect of building these bridges, such an important aspect of politicizing society to defend themselves, to find ideologies that work for them, and to find mechanisms and institutions that allow them to protect themselves. So I would like to leave it there. I do apologize. I'm really not sure how long I've been talking, and I wish I could be available to take some of your questions. I know I've really rushed through this. I really apologize, but the most important thing that I want to leave with you is that we have to have hope. And despite what we are seeing with COVID and the pandemic and all kinds of injustices being amplified, we must believe that a better world is possible. We must believe in our capacity to implement change, every single one of us. But when we are united with a common goal that is for the best of everybody in the community, we are capable of bringing about profound change and progress, equality and justice within our societies. So thank you very, very much for your time. Thank you so much for listening to me. I will leave it for Louison to pass on my email to anyone who wishes to ask me a question, or if you just want to engage in a dialogue with me, I would be more than happy to respond. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you very, very much for everything. And I hope that the rest of the semana is very informative and educational for everybody. Thank you.